So for our final interview, we have the pleasure of hearing another one of the Senate's most passionate advocates and outspoken leaders of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Since his election in 2012, Senator Ted Cruz has, Texas, he's backed multiple pieces of pro-Israel legislation. He led the effort to sanction Hamas and Hezbollah's use of human shields. He's the chief author of the Sanctioning the Use of Civilians as Defenseless Shields Act, another great congressional name for a bill. He has pressed for increased sanctions on Iran. He has opposed the campaign to boycott Israel, and he has led a bipartisan Senate resolution to condemn anti-Semitism within the United States, which passed unanimously. Everyone, please join me in welcoming a true friend of our movement, Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, welcome. Nice to see you. Welcome, Senator. You've got some Texans here and great fans. So I mentioned previously, during the last Congress, you authored a very important piece of legislation that would sanction Hamas and Hezbollah for their use of human shields. Passed the Senate, passed the Congress, actually, and became law, which doesn't happen very often these days. So maybe talk to us a little bit about the legislation, why you decided to do it, how you got it through Congress, and what impact, if any, it's having today.
Well, sure. Let me start by saying thank you to everyone who is here with AIPAC. You guys have a tremendous impact, and I think it has never been more important than it is right now to strengthen and assure the bipartisan commitment to making stronger and unshakable America and Israel's friendship and alliance. During the 8 years I've been in the Senate, I have resolved to be Israel's strongest defender in the United States Senate.
You've been a great friend. Thank you.
And one of the things that I'm grateful for is that we've seen real success in terms of bipartisan legislation moving forward. The human shields legislation, I joined with then Democratic Senator Joe Donnelly, and we authored it imposing sanctions on Hamas, on Hezbollah, on the Houthis, on any organizations that deliberately use human shields, that use their citizens as a way to protect military installations, as military efforts. You know, I'm reminded of something that Prime Minister Netanyahu said really powerfully when he was talking about Hamas that was using human shields in Gaza and was raining rockets into Israel. And Prime Minister Netanyahu said, they use their citizens to protect their missiles. We use our missiles to protect our citizens.
Great line.
That was a powerful explanation that there's not a moral equivalence between the brave IDF soldiers who are defending Israel and the terrorists who are targeting women and children. And so this legislation sanctions the terrorist organizations that use human shield. It actually builds upon a bipartisan resolution that I introduced and passed with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand that condemned the use of human shields as a war crime. And you know, I want to underscore another really important bipartisan measure. When we were here last year, we had just seen a series of disturbing and I think anti-Semitic comments coming from some members of the House. And it was a very bad threshold. And we saw the House try to take up a resolution condemning anti-Semitism, and we saw the coalition fracture apart. And so when we were here last time, we were all grieving for what we'd just seen. Well, as you know, I sought out Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia, and I said, Tim, the Senate needs to do better. Let's team up and demonstrate that we can do this right. And so we crafted it together. It's an unequivocal denunciation of anti-Semitism. It's an unequivocal denunciation of BDS. And Tim and I took it together to the floor of the Senate, and we passed it unanimously.
Thank you. Thank you for that and for the Human Shields legislation, both very important pieces of legislation. On another topic that you've been very vocal about is Iran.
Yeah.
And we know that they continue to be a threat to the United States, to Israel. And the administration has imposed some of the toughest sanctions against the Iranians we've seen. And it's starting to have a real impact on the Iranian economy. The real question is, what happens next?
Yeah.
How do we stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon? How do we constrain their regional aggression in the region?
So there's a lot more we can and should be doing. Let me stop and take a moment's retrospective, though, in terms of how we get here. And given the sophistication of this audience, let me get into the weeds a little bit. Okay. So the most important foreign policy decision, I believe, of this administration in the last 3.5 years has been the decision to pull out of the disastrous Obama-Iran nuclear deal.
You won't get a disagreement in this crowd.
That was a battle. It was a battle on Capitol Hill, but it was a battle within the administration. Both the State Department and the Defense Department opposed pulling out of the Iran deal. And I made the case repeatedly to the president that a nuclear Iran, that when the Ayatollah Khamenei says death to Israel and death to America, that I believe him, and let's not give him billions of dollars to make it happen. So the president agreed with me. He made what I think was a courageous decision to pull out of that deal. But after that happened, it wasn't done then. There were a series of other waivers that were put in place that kept elements of the deal in place. So, for example, there was something called an oil waiver. We had a waiver in place after we pulled out of the Iran deal that allowed the Ayatollah to sell 1 million barrels of oil a day. It was funding their regime. It was funding their terror activities. There was a fight within the administration about whether to end those oil waivers. The State Department didn't want to end it. And the State Department argued if we end the oil waivers, it'll cause the price of oil and the price of gasoline to skyrocket. The Energy Department came in and said, no, that's ridiculous. There's plenty of supply. Well, I leaned in heavily in favor of ending the waivers. The president agreed. We ended the waivers, and we cut off the funds on 1 million barrels a day of oil sales. Now, you asked about what to do right now. I can tell you what I've urged the president. I've urged him privately and publicly to do. There are 2 steps we should do directly to Iran to ensure that maximum pressure means maximum pressure. Number 1, there were a total of 7 civilian nuclear waivers, in addition to the oil waivers, that allowed different, quote, civilian nuclear activity. I think none of these made sense. I've been pressing to revoke all 7. They've revoked 3 of them. One of the waivers we have in place right now concerns Fordo. Fordo is a bunker built into the side of a mountain that the Ayatollah built to develop nuclear weapons. We have a waiver in place right now that says go ahead with nuclear research in Fordo. That makes no sense. So what I've urged the president to do is revoke every single one of the civilian nuclear waivers to put maximum pressure on Iran. And number 2, to invoke what are called the snapback sanctions under the Iran deal. So under the terms of the Iran deal, any of the original participants in the deal can invoke snapback sanctions, which means all of the UN sanctions go back against Iran, all of the other countries' sanctions go back against Iran. And under the terms of the deal, even though we've withdrawn, as an original signatory, we have the authority to invoke those snapback sanctions. I am urging the president to do so. Now, the Europeans don't want us to do so. But here's the real risk, and there is a fight, as it's a daily trench warfare going on within the executive branch of the government. There are career staffers at State, at Treasury, at DOD, who want to see the Iran deal come back. Trying to slow walk every one of these decisions. They don't want to see the snapback sanctions invoked because it makes it much harder if we have another president in January to go back to the deal. So this whole fight between now and Election Day, I want to make it impossible to resuscitate this deal because I don't want to give billions to a theocratic lunatic who wants to kill us.
So one last question, Senator. As you know, the UN has been a hotbed of activity against Israel for many years, and the latest incarnation of that is the UN Human Rights Council, which doesn't have time to deal with real human rights issues, but does have time always to deal with Israel.
No, that's not fair. It also stands up for paragons of human rights like Libya and Cuba.
Correct. Their latest is to publish this database, quote-unquote database, of companies that do business not just in the West Bank, but in Jerusalem and in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, and eventually turn it into a blacklist. So the question is, we're not members of the council anymore. We don't contribute to the council. What can we do to stop these kinds of anti-Israel activities promoted by the BDS movement and by the Palestinians themselves?
So this is a direct manifestation of BDS. And then this is an effort from the UN Human Rights Council to have boycotts. By the way, boycotts against American companies for not boycotting Judea and Samaria, for not boycotting Jerusalem. They are trying to pressure international companies, and especially American companies, if you don't take part of the BDS movement, if you don't boycott Israel, we will come against you. I think the administration needs to use our force, our voice, and our money to stop this. And if you think back to 2016, November and December of 2016, right after the presidential election, the Obama administration abstained while the UN Security Council passed Resolution 2334, one of the most shameful moments in the history of the UN, and that's it wrongfully condemned much of modern-day Israel as illegal and illegitimately occupied. It condemned the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem as illegally occupied territory. It condemned the Wailing Wall as illegally occupied territory. It was based on a mountain of lies, and I'll tell you what I urged. I introduced legislation. I think the United States should halt our UN dues payments unless and until they rescind that shameful resolution.
Anything in terms of the ICC as well? You know, the ICC is now engaged in an exercise, a very dangerous one, where Israel could be hauled before the court and Israeli officials subject to secret arrest warrants anywhere in the world.
So the ICC is one of the most profound threats to Israel, and it's an attempt to use lawfare to go after Israel. The first time I went to Israel was right after I'd been elected in 2012. It was before I was sworn in. It was an AIPAC trip. Right. I've been to Israel now 4 times. I remember that first time sitting in Prime Minister Netanyahu's office, and he brought up the ICC back then. I hadn't even been sworn into office, but I had argued a case in the U.S. Supreme Court called Medellin versus Texas that stood up and resisted the World Court and the United Nations when they attempted to control the U.S. justice system, and I'd won a landmark 6-3 victory. So Bibi and I talked back then about how do we press back against the ICC coming after us. So we've been talking now for 8 years. When Bibi was here in D.C. with the president for the announcement of their efforts on peace, he and I sat down and had a very productive one-on-one. And I would say 80% of what we talked about was the ICC and how this is a moment in time. What I'd like to see is an effort at the UN Security Council to prevent the International Criminal Court from moving against any member state that is not any nation state that is not a member. That would protect Israel, and it would protect the United States from our enemies using the ICC to try to target our citizens and our soldiers for persecution.
Does that have any chance?
You know, I don't know. It's an interesting dynamic. At this point, we have to convince, number one, this administration. Yeah. Number two, we have to convince our allies at a minimum not to block it.
Right.
And then we have to convince Russia and China not to veto it. All of that being said, I don't think that's impossible.
Because they're at risk as well.
At risk as well. So we've got a unique moment where if we can move through the Security Council a prohibition on the ICC going against non-member states, then that can't change without an affirmative Security Council vote that a subsequent U.S. administration could veto. So we flip the default. And look, in terms of the ICC, if it ever acts as a legitimate tribunal, then nation states may decide they want to subject themselves to it. But if it just remains a hotbed for anti-Israel hostility, if it remains a kangaroo court, then it's not going to have the legitimacy. That actually incentivizes it to behave like a legitimate organization and not just a vehicle for anti-Semitism.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Senator Cruz, for being here with us this afternoon, but most of all for your strong support and your leadership on this issue. We are tremendously grateful for all you do. Thank you very much.
And thank you to each of you. You guys are doing an amazing job.